Throughout history, war has served as a powerful catalyst for the colonization of the animal body, co-opting non-human life in order to extend the sensory and/or physical capacity of the war machine. These efforts have generally proceeded from enduring hierarchies between human and animal. The logic of the war animal thus appears to reiterate the modernist pursuit of an infinite expansion of human agency via prosthetic supplement, with the animal serving as simply one more auxiliary organ of Freud's prosthetic God. In practice, however, the entanglement of the animal body with the technologies of war suggests a less stable and deterministic trajectory, one in which the zoological component proves capable of not only exceeding these attempts at capture, but also destabilizing the anthropomorphic base of this narrative in the process. These seeming affirmations of human dominance over non-human life are in fact always already simultaneous with the production of what I will call the animal remainder. Most immediately, this remainder encompasses that part of animal agency that exceeds human influence at the site of extension. However, reading this excess diachronically presents the prospect of a second layer, whereby a disembodied and virtual animal agency circulates within the machine, continuing to exert influence upon the apparatus long after the animal body has been left behind. Excavating this vestige of the zoological within contemporary martial networks not only presents alternate histories outside of the progressivist narrative of technology, but also opens up new ways of reading the various modes of convergence that accompany the trope of the animal in drone art. This presentation begins the process of unearthing the animal from the modern drone by discussing the integration of birds into combat during the first half of the 20th century. In these early experiments, drones not only offered a means of materializing an enduring connection between flight and surveillance, which had occupied the imaginary for centuries, but perhaps more importantly, introduced the time-space differential of an aerial proxy through which the thoroughly modern asymmetry of warfare would come into being. Two critical touchstones or moments of rupture animate this narrative. First, the displacement of motor and ocular functions to the animal via Dr. Julius Neubronner's experiments with pigeon photographers during World War I. And second, the outsourcing of processes of targeting to pigeons in B.F. Skinner's Project Orcon. Through these early initiatives, birds were called upon to formalize a sensory motor schema that would echo through successive martial technologies before materializing in the technological interfaces of the modern drone. The emerging genre of drone art acknowledges the presence of this undead body by way of two distinct modes of convergence. The first, represented by Mato Atom's short film Seagulls, seeks to challenge drone power by accelerating its tendency toward interpenetration, enfolding, and hybridity. While the second, exemplified by the Not a Bug Splat installation in Pakistan, pursues similar ends by actively extracting the human from its entanglement with the animal. By prompting the technological interface of the drone to divulge its animality, these works imagine not only alternate histories of war, but also alternate realizations of its technologies. In this regard, the inverse modes of becoming represented by these works access complementary operations that collectively reproduce the animal assemblages of drone power so as to steer their capacity for becoming away from the imperial ends of networked warfare. In the first decade of the 20th century, a pharmacist in Kronberg, Germany, named Julius Neubronner, began using pigeons to deliver prescriptions to a local hospital. After one of his pigeons lost its way and went missing for several weeks, the doctor and part-time inventor devised a way to track the routes of his birds. With lightweight double-lens cameras attached to their breast, the birds would unknowingly take pictures of the ground below at regular intervals. The timing of this operation was governed by a pneumatic rubber ball, which was pumped with air beforehand according to the distance to be traveled. As the pressure decreased, a spring system triggered the shutter and advanced the film to the next frame. Recognizing an affinity between the ability of these pigeons to grant visual access to otherwise inaccessible landscapes and the operations of military reconnaissance, Neubronner began a series of tests to gauge the readiness of these birds for the battlefield. The results were encouraging. Not only were the birds largely indifferent to explosions, but they were also skilled at flying low enough to get highly detailed images while at the same time evading enemy fire. The doctor quickly patented the invention under the title Method of and Means for Taking Photographs of Landscapes from Above, and not long after, the Prussian army purchased his camera and flashy dovecoat darkroom combination used for developing images on location. While pigeons would remain an important means of transporting encrypted information throughout 20th century warfare, their stint as wartime photographers would be brief. Just as World War I was beginning, Neubronner was informed by the Prussian War Office that, quote, the introduction of aerial photography from aircraft had rendered the project obsolete, removing the parallax distortions and blurred focus that characterized the work of the avian photographer. Airplane-mounted cameras produce standardized and scalable images. In this arrangement, gyroscopes, barometers, and the sensorium of the human operator collaborated to consistently align the film plane with the horizon so that accurate, measurable distances could be extracted from aerial images. As a result, the coherent and singular vantage point of the photograph, which was subordinated to indices of animal movement in the pigeon photographs, was resurrected as a properly cartographic gaze in the aerial reconnaissance photographs that followed. In turn, the modern airplane was no longer simply a means for delivering bombs or transporting bodies, but now, as Lieutenant Colonel McLeod put it in 1919, also served as, quote, a traveling observation platform. Whereas modernism staged these interventions as momentary deferrals to the animal body in order to realize a new sensorium, the Pigeon Project in Kronberg articulated these same relations in less deterministic terms. Specifically, as Neubronner's camera fails to fully conform to the animal body, it presents a mode of convergence that recognizes the persistence of non-human agency within these assemblages. Pigeons have a 340-degree field of vision, which is made possible by the bifoveal structure of their eyes. Unlike the human eye, which contains a single concentrated center of receptors that focuses vision in a frontal direction, the eyes of pigeons, like many birds, articulate two visual systems, frontal and lateral. This structural heterogeneity produces dual focal points, which do not necessarily operate in the service of parallax view, but rather allow vision to move between binocular front vision and monocular side view. As Howard and Rogers describe, quote, when threatened, lateral-eyed animals such as the pigeon turn their eyes outward to gain panoramic vision at the expense of losing binocular overlap. When they wish to get a better view of something ahead of them, they converge their eyes to increase binocular overlap at the expense of some loss of panoramic vision. By organizing light around a single receptive surface of the film plane, the camera articulates a mode of seeing that contradicts the non-hierarchical relation between center and periphery of pigeon vision. The ascendancy of the camera's singular vantage point and comparatively narrow angle of view place the pigeon in the service of a familiar anthropomorphic mode of extension. And yet, despite this anthropomorphism, these photographs which Ruth Erickson so wonderfully describes as, quote, redolent with the activity of their own making, visualize an indexical presence of the animal that exceeds the confines of representation. Through their off-centered compositions, expansive spaces, and hints of the animal body itself, and you can see in the bottom right image there the wings of the pigeon. These photographs summon an animal remainder, an excess that resides on the boundary of presence and absence. In this tension between the human-centric translation of reality into an image and the indexical presence of the animal body, These images articulate this animal outside in futural terms as a presence that will circulate through successive technologies, first as a living body and then as a formalized mode of processing sensory information. This possibility is confirmed by Skinner's World War II Project ORCON, or Organic Control, a government-funded research project in which pigeons were placed in the nose cone of a missile so as to guide it to its target during flight. Inside, the birds would peck at an image of the target produced by a camera obscura. The locational information harvested by the screen would then be used to automatically open and close chambers on the sides of the missile to guide its path. So I'm going to play this video here while I continue to talk. Let me turn off the sound. Although Skinner's project proved highly effective in initial tests, it was eventually replaced by a guided missile system developed by RCA, which allowed human operators to remotely control missiles via a television signal transmitted from the nose of the explosive. Not only did the system use the same airframe as Skinner's project, but so too would the interface and screen of the pigeon be reproduced nearly identically for the human operator. In Skinner's prototype, the plate upon which the image was projected was coated with a semiconductor that was activated by a gold electrode attached to the bird's beak. RCA's BAT system revamped this technology as the pick-off display converter, which allowed human radar operators to convey locational data by tapping a particular area of the screen with a special tool, a method that demonstrated greater accuracy and speed than verbal description. In Project Orcon, the lack of a common language between animals and humans necessitated an indexical and embodied mode of sign making. The zoo semiotics that emerged from this encounter would structure human interactions with remote technologies long after the disappearance of the animal operator. One need only look at drone technologies such as Argus IS to find confirmation of this relationship. Here, the avian prehistory formed by the work of Neubronner, Skinner, and others comprises an undead body that effectively redistributes the parameters of human and non-human agencies within martial networks in order to realize a comprehensive system of ground surveillance. Focusing nearly 400 sensors through multiple image stabilized telescopic lenses, the Argus system is able to monitor all moving objects within an area of 36 square miles in real time from a single aerial vehicle. Live feeds are stitched together into an image which acts less as a totality than as an interface through which users can access highly detailed concurrent images alongside broader contextual views of the same scene and/or multiple fragmented views of other locations. The spatial montage formed by this live image mosaic actualizes an animal remainder of earlier systems, creating a hybrid mode of vision through which the human eye is able to take on an animal dimension via the technology's simultaneity of panoramic lateral vision and high resolution frontal views, just as the pigeon structure vision that I discussed earlier. Similarly, the formalized view by which these modes of vision were made accessible to human operators in Skinner's project and the BAT system that followed resurface in the familiar language of the touchscreen. As the Argus interface translates taps, drags, pinches, and swipes to martial modes of surveillance, human fingers act as the beak of this missing animal body as they effectively reconfigure the image according to an avian mode of sensing. This brief history illustrates what Donna Haraway describes as the co-adaptation that follows from the convergence of media, animals, and humans. Writing on a spate of television shows that utilize critter cams to give audiences access to the animal world, she explains, insofar as I and my machines use an animal, I am used by an animal with its attached machine. I must adapt to the specific animals, even as I work for years to learn to induce them to adapt to me and my artifacts in particular kinds of knowledge projects. Specific sorts of animals and specific ecologies and histories make me adapt to them, even as their life doings become the meaning making generator of my work. If those animals are wearing something of my making, our mutual but unidentical co-adaptation will be different. End quote. While one cannot simply place a camera on an animal and expect to faithfully capture animal vision, Haraway reminds us that this does not necessarily mean that the medium of photography and its human operator are not reconfigured by virtue of this encounter with the non-human animal. In this regard, her comments clearly go further than a simple critique of humanistic modes of extension via the animal. By associating this process with the extended temporal narrative of adaptation, she suggests that this relationship extends beyond the immediacy of these assemblages, forming a zoological paradigm through which histories of technology can be read. In these terms, the animal excess is not so much the causal agent behind contemporary drones, i.e., does not provide the direct inspiration for or serve as the predecessor to these technologies in a linear or deterministic way, but rather presents an outside that is partially recouped by successive generations of technology. It is this ability of civilian media to not only reveal this persistence of the animal within military technology, but to co-opt its powers of becoming that the film Seagulls seeks to harness. Seagulls is a short experimental work that centers on the relationship between a young woman and a drone. Throughout the work, the drone refuses the invisibility of conventional modes of surveillance and speaks to the unnamed female character through Facebook statuses and subtitles, which appear on the bottom of the film frame. Over a montage of the female character's birth, childhood, and adolescence, we read, quote, "I watched you grow up. I followed you in the forest." At one point, the young woman addresses the drone with a question that she types into her Facebook status window. Quote, "Why are your eyes so big?" As the film cuts to a close-up of the lenses within the drone's rotating turret, a subtitle explains, "So I can see you better." These enclosed and inaudible exchanges establish a sense of intimacy between the inorganic surveiller and the organic surveilled. Eventually, as the hierarchies of conventional modes of surveillance buckle under the weight of connectivity, a familiar horizontal mode of power comes into being. And yet, despite the openness and transparency of these encounters, spatially, Seagulls reiterates the remove that traditionally structures practices of surveillance. Communicating exclusively through images and screens, the drone and its subject occupy separate diegetic spaces throughout the film. Everyday scenes of the girl's adolescence are cross-cut with sequences of the drone moving through a kind of digital ether in which images of the same or similar events ebb and flow within the network's potentiality. Their paths flow in parallel to one another and yet never seem to touch. All of this changes in the final scene when the drone suddenly appears at a vacant beach where the young woman is sunbathing. For the first time, this dispersed present assumes a coherent and singular form which hovers above the bikini-clad young woman. Without a word, it suggestively lowers its landing gear as if to penetrate her. As the young woman arches her body and quickens her breath, the plane abruptly turns into a blood-drenched wolf, frozen in pursuit of a red balloon. The use of the intraframe transition of compositing positions the animal as the fulcrum by which the progressivist narrative of technology is folded in on itself, producing an archaeological history of the drone in which the animal is co-present with its inorganic successor. With the next cut, the drone returns, only now it is surrounded by a swarm of identical UAVs floating in the distance. This panoramic shot diagrams the dynamic exchange that has taken place as the human in the foreground, the animal in the middle ground represented by the seagulls, and the inorganic presence of the drone in the background now circulate within the frame as co-constituent forces. The interpenetration the scene visualizes is as much ontological as sexual, a shape-shifting that pushes this convergence of agencies beyond human-centric models of extension. The ability of the film to divulge what Haraway calls the, quote, animal-human technology hermeneutic relation is bolstered by its intertextual relations to the familiar fairy tale of Little Red Riding Hood. Something you might have guessed based on the dialogue that we just discussed. As mentioned previously, not only does the unnamed female ask the drone, "Why are your eyes so big?" but so does it admit to following her into the woods earlier in the film. However, it is the abrupt appearance of the wolf at the end of the film that unlocks these otherwise buried references. The introduction of this intertextual layering at this particular moment is telling, as it suggests a productive overlap between the cultural function and historical roots of this tale and the animal-human hybridity that occupies the film in this final scene. In a well-known version of the story, Little Red Riding Hood is eaten and then cut out of the wolf's belly by a lumberjack, who then fills the animal's stomach to prevent him from running after them when he wakes up. Alan Dundes has argued that this feature of the narrative is a direct reference to ancient puberty rites, and that the young girl's dramatic emergence from the wolf is synonymous with her having achieved womanhood. In this, she moves from a state of non-differentiation via the entanglement with the animal to a fully formed and autonomous individual who is recognized by the community as such. In the case of seagulls, this hybrid form turns back upon a technical infrastructure, associating the interpenetration of animal and human with the violence of drone power. As a result, the role of the sexual predator of the drone/wolf is to join with the human body so as to return it to a state of non-differentiation that can be internalized and recirculated as potentiality within the technological interface. Through this web of shifting ontologies, the animal comes to loosen and transmogrify, forming an enfleshed convergence of forces that exemplifies what Akira Lippert refers to as the Annie metaphor. Lippert explains that as the animal is subject without human language, the point of contact between these two systems marks the limit of the latter. And yet, because of the original topography that humans and animals share, the animal also brings to language something that is vital. Specifically, it presents the possibility of breaching the symbolic, enacting a specific mode of embodiment that Lippert describes as, quote, a metaphor made flesh, a living metaphor in which the metaphoricity of the metaphor collapses, becoming metamorphic rather than metaphoric. In its surpassing of the analogical aspect of metaphor, this constellation not only bears witness to a complex and nonlinear history between the animal and human, but in so doing implicitly offers the means by which these assemblages might be opened up to their constitutive parts. As works such as Seagull's contextualize these relationships within the infrastructure of the drone, this archive of technical transactions and animal sensing is rendered mobile and fluid, producing what Deleuze describes as zones of indiscernibility. In this way, the animal catalyzes a mode of convergence that resists both the human bias of extension and, more broadly, the identities and hierarchies necessary to sustain the asymmetries of the global counterinsurgency. While it is tempting to universalize this strategy into a general program of opposition, the nature of drone power and the history it incorporates refuse such a totalizing gesture. This becomes apparent when shifting these relations to the discourse of war and its recurrent trope of the animalized other. Here, processes of becoming animal become entangled with practices of bestialization, a shifting set of rhetorical and technical operations by which subjects are deprived of human status in order to justify their status as targets. As excavating the technozoological unconscious in this context risk reinforcing the very systems of violence artists seek to reimagine, an opposing set of interventions into drone power comes into focus. Inverting the operation of Adam's film, these practices utilize processes of differentiation and individuation to wrestle identities free from the field of becoming that surrounds the figure of the animal. In these instances, the strategic regression to stasis, specificity, and identity serves to interrupt a mode of martial becoming that itself utilizes the interpenetration of human and animal as a means to engender violence. Through his notion of theoretical racism, Etienne Balibar illustrates the way in which a dialectical relationship between human identity and the animal reinforces racial violence. As capitalism demands that humans be extracted from animals, quote, by animal means, i.e., the survival of the fittest, unfettered competition, and so on, the non-human is both internalized within the subject and posited as the absolute other. When this articulation of difference was paired with social Darwinism in the 19th century, says Balibar, it provided the condition of possibility for a self-sustaining racialized history. Quote, man's animality within and against man, hence the systematic bestialization of individuals and racialized human beings, is thus the means specific to theoretical racism for conceptualizing human history. Bestialized at the hand of history, an identity of the other as animal circulates as natural within the present, such that the indiscernibility of the human vis-a-vis the animal becomes the basis for repression and violence. This regressive mode of hybridization is expressed most explicitly in the context of war, where establishing the animality of the other acts as a critical component of lifting the taboo against killing. Nick Haslam's seminal psychological study on dehumanization formalizes this relationship by identifying a specific animalistic mode at work within this discourse. In these instances, the association with the animal allows the other to be portrayed as devoid of self-control, higher level thinking, and morality, all of which serves to deny the subject his or her status as human. These practices can be performative, as in, for example, the transportation of the Jews to concentration camps via overcrowded cattle cars, or more recently, the rituals of a group of rogue US servicemen who collected body parts of civilians as trophies as if they were wild game. However, this animalistic mode is more often presented at a rhetorical level, where associations of the enemy with the animal seem to function as a prerequisite for mass killing. These historical relations of bestialization also inform drone warfare, which has in fact cultivated its own unique non-human rhetorical figure to expedite anonymous killings from afar. A 2012 Rolling Stones article entitled "The Rise of Killer Drones: How America Goes to War in Secret" revealed that it is accepted lingo among CIA military and drone pilots to refer to the casualties of drone strikes as bug splats. The phrase was used in reference to the virtual models of bombing raids produced by military software. When projected on a large screen, the graphic indicating the site of detonation was said to resemble the remains of a flattened insect. Instead of the overt racism that has historically informed wartime discourse, bug splats conveys the utterly generic, a condition more than an identifiable enemy, a situation or event instead of a bona fide other. In this environment, even the color of targets would appear to no longer be a fixed quality and is instead relegated to the sphere of probability. As one intelligence officer describes, quote, "You actually get a picture of a compound and there will be something on it that looks like a bug splat, actually with red, yellow, and green, with red being anybody in that spot that's dead, yellow stands a chance of being wounded, and green we expect no harm to come to individuals where there is green." While skin color can never be wholly collapsed with race, the removal of this epidural signifier by drone targeting systems nonetheless conceals the racial identity of the target. And yet this concealment initiates a series of strategic contradictions that allow drone power to perpetuate racial hierarchies. On the one hand, as J.D. Schnepf, who I know has been a speaker here a few weeks ago, describes, by, quote, turning all bodies into indistinct human morphologies that cannot be differentiated according to conventional visible light indicators of gender, race, or class, end quote. This mode of seeing understands all subjects as possible targets of drone violence. However, as this operation takes place almost exclusively within areas such as Pakistan, Yemen, or Somalia, it simultaneously preserves, quote, existing power hierarchies of race. Reading the trope of the bug splat in combination with this decoloring of the subject introduces a similar tension. Indeed, while the technological environment this term operates within eradicates identity, the term reiterates the ratio speciest motivations of bestialization in its reduction of bodies of color to entomological waste. Marking a summation of behaviors, practices, and habits, the bug splat in this way serves as the technological equivalent of what Balibar describes as racism without race. With this in mind, it's clear that utilizing the animal as an aesthetic strategy runs the risk of reproducing this kind of bestialization that undergirds drone violence. Seagulls formed interspecies convergences in order to excavate an alternate historical narrative of the drone, one that displaced the progressivist, human-centric narrative of innovation with a more circular entanglement of human and non-human agencies. However, this program focused on the representations of drones themselves rather than their targets. The latter project requires an alternate engagement with the animality of drones, one that would utilize the strategic introduction of a particular community and place, what Jordan Crandall calls the geographical specificity of the material event, to provide the conditions by which a collective reimagination of drone power could take place. Extending this logic to the current conversation of animality, one wonders what would happen if the generic placeholder of the bug splat were made to appear with the kind of material specificities and discrete identities that the drone system of targeting denies them. Could the process of becoming that animates martial networks accommodate such heavily localized and stubbornly static signifiers? Or would they buckle under the weight, finally delivering the asymmetries and space-time compressions of drone operation for a public for whom drones remain enigmatic and distant? It's precisely these questions that a recent art installation in Pakistan explores as it attempts to counteract the bestialization of drone violence. In the Khyber province of Pakistan, an artist collective installed a monumental image of the face of a child who had lost her parents and two younger siblings as a result of a US drone strike. Entitled #NotABugSplat, the haunting eyes of this 90 by 60 foot portrait gaze up toward the sky as if addressing someone or something beyond the reach of human vision. According to the group, the intended audience for the piece is twofold. First, it addresses mapping satellites, which in capturing the image inadvertently create a permanent memorial to this young girl and her slain family that has persisted even after the work was dismantled. Second, this face was intended to engage the eye of the drone so that the operator in Arizona and the Marshall network in which he or she was immersed would be forced to acknowledge this data artifact as a human subject rather than a bestialized other. As the artist put it, the oversized portrait targets predator drone operators sitting thousands of miles away who refer to kills as bug splats. Now they'll see a child's face instead. Emmanuel Levinas argues that the face-to-face encounter provides the precognitive dimension of ethics. Critical to this status is the capacity of the face of the other to issue a particular and sustained injunction. It orders and ordains, in Levinas's words, us not to kill. It does so not simply by exposing the helplessness or nakedness of the other, although this is certainly part of it, but more fundamentally by summoning a universal law that calls upon the seer to suspend violence against this individual. For Levinas, this commandment operates outside of symbolic relations and in fact precedes the will of the one who sees the face. Indeed, the nonviolence summoned by the face of the other cannot be attributed to human nature, nor can it even be explained by philosophy, according to Levinas. Far from the kind of moral awakening popular culture traditionally attributes to such moments of recognition, the ethics of the face in this formulation is non-deliberative and non-reflective, hence its universality and power. As Levinas puts it, the first word of the face is, "Thou shalt not kill." It is an order. There is a commandment in the appearance of the face, as if a master spoke to me. Shattering the narcissism of this martial gaze with a fully formed human other, the installation negates not only the relations of bestialization that turn humans into targets under drones, but also the necessary absence of the face in these relations of violence. As Chamayou points out, quote, the resolution of the images that members of the kill chain typically work from, although detailed enough to allow the operator to aim, is not good enough to distinguish faces. All that the operator can see are little figures blurred into facelessness. This facelessness is representative of a strategic disassociation that Svea Brownhart references in her insistence that, quote, what the drone's camera, together with the lack of bandwidth and a global data transmission, achieves is a highly functional condition that, at least theoretically, is meant to allow operators to fulfill their task without being troubled by empathy or relationality. Following Levinas, the introjection of the face into these relations would then act as a corrective to both the inability of drone power to recognize the other outside of the bestial mode and the excessive technological mediation upon which drone power relies, both of which strategically obscure the primary status of the face-to-face encounter and its insistence upon nonviolence. In interjecting singular identities and individualized narratives into the distributed relations of drone power, the project effectively inverts the strategies of seagulls so that the goal is no longer to engender strategic enfoldment between species, but rather forcibly extract the human from the animal. John Durham Peters has described zoology as, quote, the open book of media theory, inasmuch as it is a constant study of varieties of embodiment and the diversity of endowments. Peters' interest in the animal is part of a larger project of recuperating natural formations such as fire, sky, and sea as instances of elemental media. However, this figure of the open book also serves as a productive means of thinking about media history, which is itself structured as a kind of bestiary through which one thumbs backwards and forwards in order to resuscitate various modes of embodiment and sensory experiences. This dynamic intersection of zoological, technological, and human spheres is in many ways the subject of a recent work by Dutch artist Bart Jensen. Oh, sorry. The project began with the passing of Jensen's cat, who was aptly named Orville after the Wright brother, credited with ushering in the era of modern aviation. To pay tribute to his companion, Jensen created Orvillecopter, a zoo drone that resurrects his deceased pet as a functioning quadcopter. While these pieces are shown and flown in art galleries, most viewers encounter them through the artist's rather unassuming YouTube videos, in which he stages test flights in what appear to be his backyard. Following a recurring format, Jensen's videos are bookended by takeoff and landing sequences that feature the artist manipulating the animal drone via remote. The sense of control and intentionality that these shots establish is, however, quickly compromised as the animal elevates and takes to sky, where the agencies of machine, animal, and human become less distinct. In this regard, these videos dramatize the work's capacity to perform drone art's contentious relationship to the animal, a relationship which articulates both the symbolic rupture of interspecies enfoldment and the entrapment of anthropocentrism. The distinctly human posture of these creatures, whose legs, and by the way, he does multiple works along these lines. His cat was his first one. Of these creatures whose legs extend forward like the outstretched arms of a familiar gravity-defying action hero, is clearly the projection of an anthropoid fantasy of flight. This symbolic capture is made literal as these vehicles congeal into grounded sculptural objects. Resting on the pedestal in the white cube, the taxidermied flesh transforms these animal bodies into a kind of perverse trophy, conveying an absolute subordination to human will. The act of flight, on the other hand, pushes these contradictions toward productive ends, revealing the co-constitutive nature of these agencies and the dynamic non-chronologies that subtend their histories. As these uncanny vehicles invite the viewer to confuse the locomotion of the machine with the bodily motion of this deceased animal, one has the impression that it is the undead non-human rather than the artist's manipulation of the remote control that leads the aircraft through space. In this way, the containment of the animal body gives way to unassimilability, a symbolic dissonance by which the animal escapes not only the functionality of the progressivist narrative of technology, but also the categories upon which such relations rely. Suspended between life and death via the absolute stasis of taxidermy and the uncanny locomotion of the UAV, this animal corpse inadvertently performs the persistence of the non-human body within the war machine. As such, its movement is no longer simple locomotion, but rather the temporal and spatial performance of a counter-revolution between species and their technological supplements. This flight confirms the immortality of Neubrunner's pigeon photographers, their silent insistence that the animal prehistory of drone technology not be sublated by its modern counterparts. It posits the animal as a structuring absence that haunts the drone's interfaces, operations, and possibilities. As the UAV buckles under the weight of its new flesh, these works come to occupy zones of discernibility that populate seagulls and not a bug splat. In so doing, they reveal a shared necromancy by which the animal body is continually resuscitated by the violence of war. And yet, Jensen's zoo drone also refuses this recurring fantasy. After all, it's difficult to imagine how the inorganic appendages that adhere to this non-human body could establish tactical advantage. Hovering precariously in galleries and YouTube videos, these assemblages clearly do not assimilate the animal body as a means to improve flight, nor do they supplement the human eye by way of this animal machine. This rejection of the prosthetic modality is evident not only in the sheer anti-utilitarian quality of these mashups, but perhaps more important in the ambiguity they generate with regard to agency and identity. And yet their status as works of art, presentation as subject of the human gaze, and continual deferral to the human artist as origin of meaning all serve to return these bodies to the anthropocentric narrative of the wartime animal. In this way, Jensen's zoo drones embody drone art's conflicting approaches to interspecies convergence. Their movement between object and agency, stasis and flight, gallery and airspace, charts the genre's contradictory program, in which the non-human animal functions as both medium for interruption of drone power and means by which its operations are made possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for a really interesting presentation. And frankly, those last images are quite disturbing. A number of those images quite disturbing. I'm not sure yet, actually, really what to make of those Bart Jensen works. But I actually wanted to ask you. You've sort of dived into this animal technological human entanglement in relation to drone art. But I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about how you think of drone art more broadly. Like, what's your sort of take on or understanding of drone art in more general terms? Because I think that to me is an interesting kind of way to situate some of what you've been talking about today.
Sure. Yeah. I think the first thing to say about this category of drone art that I establish in this talk and really more thoroughly in the book, obviously, is that it's a really expansive category, and it includes things that may not be traditionally understood as art objects, things like apps, um, theater, film, things like that, and obviously alongside gallery installations and whatnot. But I think what you're getting at is the way that I position the relationship between art production and drone power itself, which is such a thorny, complicated issue for a number of reasons. Not only because of the nature of the contemporary art world and um, the difficulty that it experiences in leaving behind a kind of Marxist framework of ideological opposition and trying to formulate a new way to relate to power in a more generalized sense. But specific to drones, there are a number of obstacles that relate to a shared technological base that drone power uses, whether it's the GPS satellites that we use to navigate, to various locations. Those are the same satellites that are used for targeting. Of course, cell phones are a big part of drone targeting, and even the evolution of the technological evolution of the kill chain is directly born out of civilian media, even charting footage from NFL broadcast as created a kind of basis for the way that enormous catalogs of video could be cataloged by the US military. The PlayStation, of course, is kind of an infamous technological predecessor, and some of the early drones use the PlayStation controller, and on and on and on. So in the book, I talk about these symmetric relationships between civilian media, the category, drone art, and the actual procedures of drone operation itself. And so, the argument I make in the book is that these works, instead of sort of starting from the assumption that there is an outside to this mode of power, work from a kind of accelerationist platform, and that they're leveraging all of these asymmetries of drone warfare and pushing them toward alternate means, rather than, taking on the kind of traditional position I think we would expect from a genre like this, which would be more more journalistic, exposing all of the atrocities that drones have been a part of, and of course there are many. You won't find that so much in drone art, and drone art as a genre maybe appears a little bit septic, really, compared to what our expectations might be. So I think that it's an important part to sort of contextualize my talk, and I'm glad you brought it out, because I think this genre maintains a really ambivalent relationship on the surface to drone power, and it really seeks to sort of work within those systems, rather than assuming a kind of outside that it can impose them from.
Yeah, thanks. I found when reading your book, I found that to be a really interesting way of thinking about drone art, and kind of provocative as well, because I can think of exceptions in some that you write about, actually, like Noor Behram's photojournalistic imagery and so on, which does kind of lay bare the devastation, and I think is like not ambivalent, right, in its relation to the system, but nevertheless, those are perhaps the kind of outliers of this genre, and interest, like, one of the things that's remarkable about them in relation to other works in the genre is their more unabashed critique. or like, and that's maybe the wrong way to put it, because a lot of the works that you look at are very critical, but more that just like willingness to present the violence itself in fairly direct fashion. And even like Marwish Chishti's work, for example, is clearly very critical, but not, like, nevertheless also does have that kind of ambivalence, right, to it. I wondered, with the, speaking of ambivalence, I think, one of the interesting things with Not a Bug Splat is that, the articulation of the project, right, around as being, for this permanent memorial and for, as a kind of confrontation to the drone operator, is no doubt like a valid and important component of the work. The one sort of complication to that perhaps is the titling with a hashtag and the clear desire for it to be a kind of viral phenomena. And on top of that, sometime afterwards, BBDO Pakistan, the kind of Pakistani outpost of the global advertising giant, won a Cannes like Advertising Lions Award for the project as a kind of innovative sort of social justice oriented, like, art meets advertising project. And so I don't raise that to kind of invalidate the project at all, but it is this kind of, it does speak to perhaps another set of ambivalences around this kind of work, or that can crop up around aspects of this kind of work.
Yeah, those are great points, and I love the way you presented the Not a Bug Splat piece as very much immersed within not only military systems of surveillance but commercial as well, because that's a whole layer that exists throughout the entire genre. And I think there's just a recognition of the inescapability of that on some level. And even the Bayram piece, and I'm assuming you're referencing the gaming and oh gosh, the photographs, gaming in Waziristan,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right. Even those photographs are really interesting because they're sort of anti-portraits in that there are several portraits where they're really focusing on the shards of US missiles on the ground, the empty craters left. And, I think it's so much about the materiality of that experience and the way in which certain conditions lead to it. It's sort of a mapping of the way in which signature strikes work, which are, of course, less about identifying a specific individual than, an event that happens when a given set of conditions are fulfilled. And there is a kind of mapping of that logic in the way those photographs are structured. But you're right. I mean, there's a very serious affective intensity to those as well.
And there's also, yeah, I think that's right. That's a really good point. I think, there's also, like, so many of those photographs show fragments of the Hellfire missile as well, which sort of insists on a materiality of the weaponry and of the infrastructure, which the kind of common depiction of the drone tends to not disappear, but background rather than bring to the fore. I've had a really great question about the short film The Seagull from Bibi Imre Millet, which is, do you have a kind of gender analysis of that of that film? Like, and this sort of really struck me as well, I have to say, while seeing those clips and hearing you talk, the penetration of the drone, the, like, figuring of the girl on the beach in particular, like innocence and sexual desire and so on. And, to add to this, my colleague Adam Fish posted in the chat as well that, there's a, the wolf's penis is like a pretty confronting moment in the way that is put together too. So yeah, your thoughts on that work and gender?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so obviously on the forefront of that scene. It's hard to deny. I mean, I have to say, it's very difficult because I think the traditional relations of gender can't be easily mapped on to the situation of drones because, I mean, we know there are a lot of drone female pilots. There are a lot of females in the military. It's not a purely, I mean, masculine in terms of the operational
Mm.
sphere. And we also know that, maybe the most determinative factor in translating human subjects into targets is male gender, right? I mean, if you're an adult male, that's one of the prerequisites, at least under the Obama administration, of qualifying as a target. So it's extremely messy. But I think the film is drawing upon more of a mechanistic 20th century understanding of combat, which does preserve that, in phallic form, does preserve that very patriarchal oppositional kind of violence. It's just very difficult for me, frankly, to map that out where it seems much more fluid. But in terms of the legibility of that violence, I think it's really, really effective.
Yeah, there's a connection to, like, you were referencing Little Red Riding Hood, and the kind of, I think your reference was more to the kind of Grimm's fairy tale version, right, which is kind of much more
Mhm.
visceral and really about that transition in a young woman's life at that time. And but then there's the remediation of that story into a more uh, into a kind of middle class morality tale, right, through the kind of French retelling. And so there's perhaps an interesting question there too about, like, what the moral referencing going on in the work might be. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I would love to see the whole film and try and kind of trying to kind of get a grip on it. I have to say, reading your book, it was one of the moments in the book where, like, because I didn't know the work as well as I knew the other ones, it was a piece that I'm like, I totally get your analysis. I'm just also like, I was unsure of the piece itself in a way. And yeah. Anyway, I should give some airing to other people's questions. And I think, oh yeah, so just tacking on to that, Angela Smith has asked a two-part question, but the first is about the red balloon in the film and how you kind of what's your take on the red balloon?
Oh gosh, I don't know. And this may be a cop out, but my reading is that it's more of a surrealist technique, of bringing these opposing symbols together. The red balloon, obviously, to me, connotes a sort of innocence, and the beginning of the film um, begins with her in a very, begins with her as an embryo, her being the female subject, and it's so much about childhood and this sort of innocence, and obviously that's very much taken away at the last scene. And in the beginning of the film, she's walking down the street carrying a balloon, which I believe is red. It's hard to tell from the way the scene is shot. I think there's a sexual reading there that I won't pursue too much further. But I don't have an easy answer for that one. I have to confess.
Mm-hmm. Um, So Angela was also curious about the agency of the pigeons in the Orcon project. How are they making decisions about their pecking and guiding choices? Like what is there? What are I guess the question, sorry if I misinterpret this, Angela, but which is about the kind of limits and possibilities of their agency within the system.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, it's classic operational conditioning where the pigeons are trained by, reinforcement with food for several weeks before being put into the missile. But, their agency is very little because if they're successful, they die. If they're not successful, um, they die as well. It's an inevitable sort of end for them. So I'm
Hmm.
not sure there's much agency there at all, except in this figure that I identified in the talk, which is this afterlife of the kind of animal sensorium that they leave behind in successive technologies. And I'm not sure that's an agency from the standpoint of the animal per
mm,
se.
mm.
Um,
But from the perspective of the assemblage, right? Like that it carries over
yeah,
and has and leaves a mark. Yeah.
right.
Um, yeah, I was thinking about when you were showing those pigeon videos, I was thinking about what those types of avian drone or avian engagements with militarism would look like today, and in particular, like avian drone in engagements. There's that odd story from a few years ago about I think it was French French agencies, or maybe it was not even anyone official, trying to train eagles with Kevlar coated talons to take down drones as a kind of counter drone technique, where we see like the animal switched around in its kind of status. It becomes the protector against the aerial threat. And I was also thinking about in one of the earlier seminars in this series, Jerris Grove was talking about the use of marine animals as carriers for weaponry, but also for surveillance. So like strapping bombs to porpoises, basically.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you've thought about what, like, not just in art, but in the way military animal entanglements take place today, whether that has a different kind of structure to those Orcon era projects.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And by the way, even in the World War I context, um, they trained hawks to assault the pigeons to stop the transmission of messages. It's really incredible. They used over 1 million pigeons during World War I, and they were touted as the most effective means of transporting information at the time. And that continues today. Attacks on drones by birds, actual birds, are a big enough problem for the U.S. military that they're staging this in their research into future drones. And I recently read that they actually constructed a robotic bird to act like an organic bird that would attack the drone to see how the drone would perform. Um, so I think it speaks to that circular relationship that just persists on and on. And you brought up the the water mammals and so on, that the Navy has an ongoing program with. Porpoises and dolphins were used for quite a long time in finding mines, and they were even used in the Vietnam War to
Mhm.
stop divers from assaulting, U.S. boats and so on. And they're now devising a robotic shark, and even a robotic jellyfish. Right now they're just used for surveillance mechanisms, but there's talk of arming those animals. So it's kind of a weird thing where the animal is sort of literally rematerializing in these new technologies, where I mean it's a very convincing shark, and it actually comes out of the water with its fin like Jaws or something like that. Whereas it seems like the narrative that I traced was all about sort of absorbing this within a technological interface. Now it feels like there is a future, to speak to the theme of the seminar here, where the animal is sort of rematerialized as such, in a way, in drone form.
We could think of, in the film Eye in the Sky,
Mm.
which, has its problems, but I think is one of the more interesting pieces of drone cinema, in that in the way it maps out the layers of mediation that take place within the system, and their complexity and some of their kind of unexpected effects. But that one of the kind of technological fantasies, or pseudo fantasies, I suppose, is the tiny insect drone that gets flown around, where it's an insect that has been made into the drone. So in a way, the like mechanical drone coming home to a kind of closer to drone, closer to a bee drone kind of status, through the kind of technological desire to make things that are less visible, more animal, more natural, more imperceptible in relation to the natural world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to switch gears a little bit. Adam Fish has posted that there's lots of drone photo festivals happening today, and so there is a kind of drone art, I suppose, that is not gallery art or contemporary art in that sense, but much more of a kind of amateur practice of art making and photography. And so, he's asking how should we think about those theoretically? Are there particular approaches or theoretical frames that you think would be valuable to read the spectacle of drone photography, perhaps outside the domains of capital A art?
Oh gosh, that's a really important, difficult question. It's such a diverse field. I feel like the first appearance of the consumer aerial drone photograph was really geared towards these formally perfect, austere sort of images. Now they're just so pervasive, it's hard to make, I think, generalizations like that. But what kind of excites me about that genre is this, what's the right word? A kind of diminishment of human intentionality that happens in some of the more interesting ones. And I mentioned surrealism earlier, and of course that was a pervasive aesthetic strategy for them. Um, at the same time, what worries me about it is I'm sometimes feel as though the technological history that's embedded in that practice is lost, because all drone photographs are conjuring issues of surveillance, issues of privacy, and that's drawing from their technological history and so on. And it's sort of wiped clean when it enters into the civilian context. So I'm not sure I have a sort of perfect theoretical framework to approach them. But I do think it's hard to totally disconnect that from the military context, where the form originates, at least partially. Obviously, Nadar in the 19th century is taking photographs of Paris from a hot air balloon, and there is a simultaneous history. Of course, that was used in the military as well. There's absolutely incestuous narratives. So um, I guess my short answer would be, contextualizing it within these martial contexts is really important.
I was reading yesterday a new book from the Australian media studies scholars Anthony McCosker and Rowan Wilkin, called Automating Vision, which has a chapter called Drone Vision, and which draws quite a bit on Anthony McCosker's articles, a couple of articles from a few years ago on drone vision and drone media. He in the chapter in the book, they talk about those sort of surreal or unexpected or strange, weird moments of drone vision, particularly say that might come through videos of drone racing, or through videos in which people are engaging in various kinds of drone acrobatics, which they then show those acrobatics. And I was thinking about that in relation to the kind of drone crash genre, which Adam, who posted the question, has done a lot of work on and published a really excellent article recently on drone crashes, and has made a documentary actually called Crash Theory about them as well. But this that aesthetic of like the drone out of control also shares something with those pigeon images, right? Where the like intentionality of a particular viewpoint is lost through the camera's relation to the movement of what it's attached to. And so, yeah, there is something very animal, bestial, I suppose, in some of that kind of crash imagery, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think there was a crash that was staged at one of the UC campuses by a group of artists that I think was very much motivated by that. And I think this dovetails with what I was mentioning in the presentation about interjecting specific locations, specific identities, materialities into the kind of virtualness of drone power has a really intense affect. And of course, the crash of the American drone in Iran and the kind of parading of that body across the Iranian media and the threat of reverse engineering that object was such a powerful event, because it was a way in which the distance and the asymmetry of that conflict sort of collapsed and was made apparently. No one really knows what happened there. Lots of conflict accounts, but it appeared momentarily sort of horizontal, because of that brute interjection of materiality that happens in the crash.
Mm. Yeah, there's something about the crash drone that has this appeal to it, I think, because it reveals the kind of fragility, particularly the military drone, the fragility of the artifact. The spindly legs, the sort of strange shape. I I was in Washington D.C. last year, and I wanted to go and see a predator drone, and it's very hard to do that, right? But there's one at the Smithsonian, and when I went, it was unfortunately not only moved away to an annex in Virginia, but when I got there to Virginia, I found the drone kind of half dismantled. And at first, I had this sort of, well, I really wanted to see like the sort of the thing in the air and get like some sense of what it looks like. But it actually, it was fascinating to see its contingency and its fragility, and it's something like what you get in the crash images of those military crash images is the fault lines and the weakness actually of that entire regime as a mode of military power, that like it has the potentiality of striking anywhere in the world, and yet at the same time these things are flying lawnmowers,
Yes.
and their capacity to be knocked out by poor weather or even by someone a very accurate marksman on the ground, has the potential to really cause some trouble for those kinds of devices. It's really interesting. I think we're kind of hitting. I don't know if we've had more questions since Adam's about the satellites. I did want to ask you maybe to tease out a little bit more. I'm really interested in the Argus IS system that you showed, and I just wanted you to say a little more about of how you see that relation between that kind of image and the animal, and particularly perhaps like if you have thoughts about the interface process, because I was watching it, like it's really gestural, right? It's the touch screen dragging and moving and so on. And yet at the same time, like we kind of know now that the system doesn't really work very well, and is like basically impossible from bandwidth perspective to run effectively, and has since been superseded anyway by other things that the military is now much more careful about keeping quiet, I think. Perhaps out of embarrassment more than secrecy. But yeah, I just wanted if you could say a little bit more about Argus IS.
Sure. The trajectory I was tracing there was one in which the early photographs from the pigeon photographers were this weird, clunky sort of amalgam of photography, which of course embeds that sort of one point perspective in an indirect way, which is very much about a human binocular situation of vision, with a system that's so completely contradictory with that way of perceiving the world. And those images sort of preserve that mashup as such to some degree, in their imprecision, which is obviously, like the Argus system, partially why they were dropped by the US military. And then, working through the BF Skinner example, you add the video component, which I think is an important differentiation between Argus and the still image, obviously. But that gestural component of the beak pecking the screen with the electrode attached, that the human operator and I just happened to pause the video at a sort of
Yeah.
perfect moment
Yeah.
where I think he was pinching or whatnot. It looked like a
Yeah.
little beak. And I try to make clear, I'm not trying to say that in any way the Argus was a direct, assimilation of B.F. Skinner's project in any way, but it is a sort of outgrowth indirectly of the way in which those early systems allowed animal vision to sort of seep in. Um, and it's an imperfect narrative. It's a circular narrative for sure. And I think it's hopefully pretty obvious that I'm drawing pretty heavily on media archaeology in the way that I'm structuring that narrative of media. But um, would that Argus be possible without that encounter with the animal and the way in which the animal introduced this outside to human vision that then could be, baked into a technological interface and conceptualized, as this weapon of violence? It's difficult to say, but when you start to sort of read military history through the animal, you do start to see these progressive technologies that integrate some of the earlier experiments in technological form in the interfaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm there's something about the kind of interfacial promise of those technologies moving. I'm thinking here less about the animality, but just about the kind of promise of the interface of those technologies as enabling a much deeper relation between the human and the technological sensing system, and in particular, a kind of fusion of human and machine learning, because the one of the kind of underlying promises of that type of system is, well, eventually, like, there will be agencies, non-human agencies, that help draw the human attention to where engagement needs to happen, so that you are directed to where you would need to pinch and view more closely and so on, right? And at the same time, the Argus IS was also supposed to be kind of conquering time, because it would provide real-time imagery, but then you would be able to access historical vision that's mapped back to a particular set of coordinates and particular bits of imagery, so that you could see change over time. In the military context, was that vehicle there 3 hours ago? Who came in and out of where, and so on, right? And so there could be this double maneuver where you overcome the limits of human image processing capacity, and also the problem of watching an event in real time and then not being able to effectively rewind, and particularly to not be able to rewind to a place where you're not already looking, right? And so you can see in those systems, the deep desire of the military planners, and of this desire to turn the eye into something so much more, the eye of the drone into something so much more powerful. And yet, at least as of that particular platform, it seems to be falling short. And yet we now don't know where things are today, I think, exactly in terms of where the military has pushed these kinds of technologies, which is perhaps an ominous thought, but maybe it is into the more and more animal. Just noting, I'm going to wrap up in a sec, but just noting that Karen Kaplan posted a question in the chat that YouTube managed not to collect. And it's just that she was just commenting about the gender politics in the seagull, and that female drone operators are recruited into and trained in a military that remains masculinist and that continues patriarchal agendas, even if they display a more multicultural, liberal kind of face. But she's running up against the limits of the length of text that that the chat box can handle, which I think maybe speaks back to some of your comments about about gender and so on in relation to that piece. So I think we're hitting the hour. So thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you very much, everybody for coming along. There's one more seminar in the Drone Futures series. It's at 10 a.m. Sydney time on Thursday, the 26th of November, which puts it in the evening, East Coast USA, and in the afternoon, Pacific time. We're going to be joined by Marwish Chishti, who I think is one of the more interesting artists working against and about drone warfare. You can register for that talk if you follow the link below the video. And speaking of following, if you're on Twitter, you can find links to my Twitter account and to the Media Futures Hub one there as well. If you've liked this talk, please do spread the word. Because we had to postpone it, I think there'll be people who weren't able to come along this time who would be keen to catch up. So please do share it if you found it interesting. The link you're using will become a regular YouTube video, and we'll be releasing this talk along with another interview on our podcast, the Media Futures Hub podcast. There's a link to the podcast in the video description, and please do subscribe to that if you like what you are doing. Thank you, Madeline, for moderating the chat, and thank you, Thomas, for a wonderful talk. I must apologize too that I think something happened, a delay. We went live with a bit of a delay, and it cut off my introduction at the beginning. So apologies for that, everyone. But thank you all for tuning in for this virtual seminar in the Drone Futures series, and for offering such insightful questions and comments. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, everybody. Stay strong, and take care of one another. Thanks for coming, and see you soon.